Oh, I thought it was up. What happened to it? Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Joel Dvoskin. I'm a psychologist from Tucson. Oh, man, I was afraid of this. Tucson, Arizona. And you can... From the beginning. I didn't do that, did I? Oh.
No, you didn't do
I thought I had a stroke. It's like all of a sudden the lights went dim. Old age is a terrible thing. Y'all can laugh now, but it sneaked right up on you. I was your age about a week ago, so. Okay, before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and what I'm doing here. In a line of work I'm in, a lot of times various agencies or entities will file lawsuits against departments if they think they're not doing business the proper way. In Alabama, there's a group called ADAP, which is the Protection Advocacy Group for the state. And oftentimes people who work in institutions or for state agencies, they kind of have a adversarial relationship with them. In this case, ADAP went to the department and they said, we'd like to bring me out and do a survey of the facility and make some recommendations. And if we have a general agreement on what we'd like to accomplish, then instead of a lawsuit, we'll just let you guys run your agency and we'll see what kind of changes we can make. So I did that. I made about 45 recommendations, and the department, I think, was in agreement with most of them. There may be some things we'll tussle about, but generally there was pretty good agreement between ADAP and the department. So they asked me to spend a year consulting with the department on some things that we're going to try to beef up. And one of the very first ones, if you don't get anything right in this business, you want to finish the day with the same number of people you started it. And you want to go home to your family safe, and you want the kids to be safe when you leave your shift. That's one thing everybody agrees on. And even though we might disagree about strategy of what's the best way to do that, I don't know, if you don't think that, then you're in the wrong business, to be very blunt. So we wanted to start with suicide prevention, and I'm a very blunt person, so I promise you today, if you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it as honestly as I can. I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings if you don't like the answer, but I believe in telling people the truth if they ask you a question. I also want to invite my friends Tim Davis and Jim Kent and Alicia Allen. If I say anything that you guys don't agree with, please speak up, because I don't want anybody to think that this is my wacky ideas from Arizona and this isn't how you're going to do business here. So if I say something that sounds wrong to you, I'm asking you right now, please have the courage to speak up, because somebody else is thinking the same thing. And it'll give me a chance to answer it. We'll talk back and forth and we'll come up with a good solution that we all live with, because the department plans on supervising to what I'm going to speak to you about today. There's a new policy coming out on suicide prevention. You'll be happy to know it's about half the size of the policy it replaced. We tried to make it simpler so that people would know exactly what's expected of them, and I'm going to talk about it today. So if you have any questions, please don't wait for me to stop talking, because it'll never happen. I'm a very talkative person. So if you got a question or a disagreement or a comment, just go ahead and speak up, or raise your hand if you prefer, and we'll work it out. Okay, Before I start with the details of this, I want to make a comment to y'all about juvenile justice. I've been doing this for about 30-some years. And one of the things I see is it's very difficult in this business to not be judgmental. These kids can be such a pain in the neck, day after day after day, whining about the same thing. I used to have a big sign in my office that said "No sniveling" on it, on the wall. Great big thing with a line going through it. Right? And it's easy to judge the kids. So the first thing I'd say is, how good was your judgment when you were 16? You know, you all look down at these kids, but look back at you at the same age, and you become a little less judgmental. But you seem to have turned out okay, and what we'd like to believe is that maybe they can too. So in my simple languages, how about cutting them a break? And considering the possibility that their bad behavior isn't necessarily all about you. I was talking to juvenile probation officers, and we had it was a small group meeting. We're talking, and they said, "Oh yeah, that kid, he drives me crazy." And I said, "So he got up this morning and he thought, you know what would really piss off my probation officer is if I ruined my life and relapsed on cocaine." That's not why people relapse on cocaine. They relapse on cocaine because it makes them feel better than their life does. It's not about you. It's got nothing to do with you. And yet it's hard to not think of it when you pour your heart and soul into doing your job well, that when a kid does relapse or stumble or fall, that somehow it was to piss you off. By the way, excuse me, I won't take the name of the Lord in vain, but I'm probably not going to get through this without cursing, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I spent too much time in corrections. The other thing I want you to understand, there's a few things. People say if a smart person goes to a lecture for 3 hours, if you ask them in 6 months, they might remember 5 things from a really good lecture. Now, I hope I'm going to do a really good job today. I'm really going to try. But I would like to tell you what the 5 things are rather than have you guess from all the stuff I'm going to throw at you. What the main things I'd like you to take home from this is. And this was the first one. Do you know what our enemy is? If you want to prevent suicide in institutions, and by the way, everything I'm going to teach you today goes for your co-workers. Police, corrections, juvenile justice have high suicide rates for workers too, because this is an emotionally draining job we have. And our enemy is despair. That's our enemy. That's what we're fighting, is hopelessness, despair. People who don't believe that they have a shot at anything better, at a better life. And above all else, we want to make sure that we don't make it worse. We didn't get hired to make kids worse. This system doesn't exist to make kids worse. And there's some research, later on this year, I'll probably be speaking to you about some of it. There's some research that shows that the juvenile justice system as it currently exists makes a lot of kids worse. And one of our goals for this year, Mr. Wood, myself, Mr. Davis, Ms. Allen, Mr. Kent, our goals is to make sure that we can say that we're positive that our system isn't making kids worse. We might not make every kid better. We might not make every kid a success, but we want to improve their odds so that if a kid does choose to go the right way, that we're making them better, not worse. I also don't want to be afraid to talk to you today about things that are, they're not cool to talk about. But if you really pour everything you have into this job, somewhere in there are these values. Your faith, and I'm not here to talk about a particular religion, but your faith in something good, in something better than how we're doing now. In hope for you, to hope for the kids, and for the kids to have hope for themselves, because I'm going to tell you a secret. Nobody ever recovered from anything without hope. Nobody got better at cutting down on their drinking. Nobody became a better wife or a better husband. Nobody got better at golf. Nobody quit offending without some hope of doing better. And charity, to cut other people a break. We do a lot of judging in this business. And as I said to you a moment ago, of all the gifts you will ever give to these kids, if you do the greatest job of anybody who's ever worked in a juvenile justice system, the greatest gift you will ever give to a child is hope. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of general correctional suicide prevention knowledge. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we have in jails in America, suicide is a huge problem. The suicide rate in jails is many times higher than it is in the general population. And you can think about why that is. It's, for most people, when they go to jail, it's one of the worst moments of their life. Especially if it's early on. If it's the first time they've been arrested, they might be a deacon of the church or a Little League coach or a member of the Rotary Club, and they drink a little too much and get in a car accident. Next thing you know, they're in jail for a DUI and they think their life's over. So jails have a very high rate of suicide. And guess what? We were able to cut that rate nationally by 2/3 just by doing a couple of things. One of them was to ask people at the front door of the jail if they're feeling suicidal. This is not rocket science. And most of the people who were feeling suicidal would tell you if you just asked them. Secondly is to watch them to make sure they don't die until the sun comes up, because one of the cures for the acute distress and despair that happens on the first night of jail is the sun coming up the next morning. And you talk to your lawyer, and you find out your family isn't going to turn their back on you, or your natural defenses start to kick in. So about 2/3 of jail suicides are very easy to prevent. And what's interesting about them and instructive for y'all is that the reason they're easy to prevent is because they're impulsive, but the window of risk is small. We know that the vast majority of suicides in jail happen in the first 24 to 72 hours. So if we can just keep an eye on people at the beginning in jail, we know we can cut out a good number of the suicides. Now in prison, we have not had similar success. And the rate in prison is about 1/3 of what the rate in jails is. And the ones in prison that we can't prevent are the same ones that we're not able to prevent in jail. And they're the ones that aren't at the front door, that aren't impulsive. So it's either somebody got some bad news that we didn't know about, or they had a depression that kept getting worse and we didn't pick it up because they were quiet. Okay. I also want to tell you that if you go through a year without a suicide, or 2 years without a suicide, or if you have 3 or 4 in the same year, God forbid, you can't go by 1 year's results and say, the year that you didn't have any suicides, you might not have done as good as you thought you did. And the year that you had a couple, you might not have done as badly as you did. Some of this is a combination, like most success in life, of really hard work and luck. You can't control everything, and there is no guarantee. There is no such thing as a suicide-proof institution. I promise you. You show me the cell that you think is safe to hold people in, and I'll show you how to kill yourself in it. And they got 24/7 to think of it. That's all they have to think about if they want to die, is how to in a room. So our long-term view is we want to make sure that we're going about our business in the right way. That we're minimizing the chances. We're going to have a place where it is not easy to die. Because if you think about how impulsive kids are, it's very likely they're going to get an impulse to take themselves out. If it's easy, then they could die. If we make it hard for them to do that, then we have time for the impulse to pass and for somebody to step in and provide help. Now, what's the worst thing about your job when it comes to suicide prevention? Well, you might not have thought about this, but I'm going to tell you what the worst part of this is. Most of you are, I'm not bringing up this idea for the first time that part of your job is to prevent people from killing themselves, and you've been working hard at it for a long time. Some of you we got any 30-year people in here? Yeah, thank you. God bless you for sticking with it, right? But you know what the worst thing, and you'll tell me if this ain't right. What's the worst thing about this job? You never get to know what you prevented. How many of you been in this business for 20 years? 10? Okay. I'll tell you, I guarantee you, if you've been doing this for more than 10 years, you have saved somebody's life. But you might not know it. You might have smiled at somebody or given them a kind word when they didn't see it coming or think they had it coming, and they made a decision to not die that day. And they don't come up to you and say, hey, guess what? I was going to kill myself, but because you were kind to me, I decided that maybe I'd take another shot at another day. People won't tell you that. So we don't know what would have happened if we didn't do our jobs properly. And it goes for a lot of things in juvenile justice, which is why a lot of people can't hang in this business, because you don't get as much of that positive feedback as people generally need, as the kids need. Okay, so what are the key components of an institutional suicide prevention program? Let me ask you. If you were starting from scratch and I said, we really want to design a program that's going to have the lowest possible chance of ever having a child commit suicide, what would you want to see in such a program? How would you go about it? Anybody?
Enough staff, adequate staff.
You would want to have adequate staffing, absolutely. Why? That's right, because you can see things that you'll miss if you have fewer staff. What else? And by the way, that was my first recommendation. My number one recommendation that I made to the department was that I felt you didn't have enough staff in the housing units. Number one. Now, I know that that's not fixable right this minute because it's a bad economy, but we want to put it on the planning map so that we don't want to tell anybody that just because we can't afford more right now that it's enough. So thank you for saying that. What else would you do? Yeah, John. Train qualified staff. Absolutely. What else would you want to have? You would have a policy and procedure on suicide prevention. What else? I want some of the people, what do you call the line staff worker again? You have a youth care worker? Every state has a different name. Youth service aide. Some of y'all speak up. What would you want to have? A safe place where you would want to feel safe. Absolutely. If you're going like this to keep yourself safe, it's a lot harder to keep an eye on them being safe. Staff need to have relationships with the residents. We might talk more about that later because you get double messages about that, don't you? You're not supposed to have relationships, but you're supposed to have a therapeutic relationship. Anybody else? Let me show you my list, which was not too far off from yours. First of all, you want to have a plan of how we're going to go about this. Failure to plan is planning to fail, right? You should have a committee a suicide prevention committee. This is one of the comments I have for the policy. We want to add a paragraph about that. Whose job is to look for things that we could do better. And it should be represented by youth service aides, by maybe a food service person. Who's going to be the first person to notice that a kid maybe doesn't have as much appetite? Might be the person that's on that serving line. Right? So people at different levels of the institution in different jobs should be on that. You would want to have training, and more training. But let me tell you something about training, ladies and gentlemen. Training is worthless without supervision. If we don't have supervisors who learn the same things as the youth service aides, I'm not new at this. I know about 4 million sergeants who say, I don't care what you learned in the academy, boy. Let me tell you how we do it here on my shift. Right? Well, Sarge, you're going to do it right on your shift or you ain't going to get to be a sergeant. Because we're all going to be on the same page here about keeping people alive. You would want to have screening at the front door because some of these kids are feeling despair when they get to you because they've just been rejected by their community. Now, y'all, everybody's been rejected by somebody. Everybody's experienced what it feels like to be told you're not good enough, you're not wanted. Whether it was getting turned down for a date or not having a date to the prom. But imagine being told you're not wanted by your own family and then by an entire community. We have nothing for you here. We want you away. We want you out of here. So we want to screen people at the front door. And when the kid comes in all blustery and cocky and walking like he's not afraid of anything in the world, there ain't a kid there that's not afraid of anything in the world. And the toughest kid in the place is the most scared because he's got the most enemies. That kid that's scaring everybody else, you scratch him and you see somebody who's crying with terror. That if I let my guard down for 1 minute, all these people I've been dumping on are going to hurt me. And he's right. He's right. You would have a mental health assessment when somebody screens positive. When somebody says, well, yeah, I have thought about killing myself. You would have enough mental health professionals, which was my second most important recommendation, is you don't have enough mental health professionals on your staff, and some of the ones you do have aren't working as mental health professionals. So that we have, poor Dr. Shaw, last time I talked to her, is on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That ain't no way to do business. Maybe you don't drink, but if you like a glass of beer occasionally and you know that you're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, when are you supposed to relax? Or go to the mountains where there's no cell phone coverage, which is exactly where I'd want to be if I was you, and had to carry that beeper 24/7. I remember, sometimes in a movie you'll see somebody throw a cell phone against the wall. Back in the day, before we had cell phones, we all had to carry these beepers, and the thing would go off, and you'd hate this little piece of plastic like it was your enemy in the world. You would want to have good communication so that when I walk around the facilities, I don't get a different story from the facility administrator than I do from the youth services aide about what's going on. So that if a youth services aide is worried about a kid, Joel, he's usually pretty upbeat and optimistic. He's been kind of quiet lately. I'm a little worried about him. We want to get to kids when we're a little worried about them, not when they got a knife to their throat. And we can't do that without good communication. And we want a place where the entire facility staff understands that every single person who works there, everybody who picks up a paycheck is essential to a suicide prevention program. Whether you're a volunteer, even a volunteer chaplain coming who's not getting a paycheck. These kids have physical needs. It may be the doctor who's going to pick it up. They have emotional needs. It may be the psychologist or the caseworker or the youth services aide. They have spiritual needs. It may be the chaplain, or it may be somebody who they talk about, how come there's no chaplain in my faith? Right? So everybody's part of this. You got to have housing options where you know that kids, when they're most suicidal, are safe. You got to have clear levels of supervision so that when an order says a level of supervision, we know for a fact that whoever's responsible for that is doing what it says on that piece of paper. I'll tell you, careers have ended and departments have lost, and I'm not making this up, $10 million because somebody thought that they were the first person to be slick about a 15-minute watch. Well, if I just mark 15 minutes for the next 4 hours, I can take a nice long nap. And then the kid dies and somebody comes in and sees that you've pre-marked it. And now, in addition to being negligent, in some cases, that's fraud. That's fraud because you lied to get your paycheck and you killed that child. Or somebody, the other dumb way to do this, and I'm probably going to insult somebody in here who's done it. I just hope it's not you. Who said, well, I'll just take a nap, and then when I wake up, I'll mark in my 15-minute checks. Well, you better hope that child doesn't die while you're sleeping, because you'll wish it was you when they get done with you. Not to mention, you might think you're hard. Be responsible for the death of a child and imagine what it's like to look in the mirror every day of how it tears at your soul that because you tried to be slick, that someone lost their life. And I've seen the toughest SOBs you ever saw in corrections break down and cry like babies when somebody died on their watch. Those are the words that you just don't want to hear in this business, is on my watch. You might think you don't care. We want to have some interventions when we identify a child as being at high risk. We would like to have a system with mental health treatment. And I'll tell you, as I said, that was my second recommendation, was that we need more mental health treatment in this system. There should be ways of responding to serious attempts. And in the event of a suicide or a serious attempt, when we should have prevented something and failed, we want to investigate it, follow up, and review it so that we're not afraid to learn from our mistakes. Because the second worst thing is to make a near lethal mistake or a lethal mistake. The worst thing is to make it twice. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Now let me stop for a second. Any questions or comments about anything I've said or disagreements, and please don't hesitate to speak up. I got pretty thick skin. Have I lost you? Are we on the same page? Give me some kind of feedback here. Have you learned anything new yet? It's okay. All right, can you hear me? I feel like Chris Rock. Is this thing on? Okay. Okay. Your goals should be reasonable. There is no such thing as suicide proof. We would like to shoot for that. That's the star we're going to navigate by. But if you think you've ever reached it, I will show you. There was a case in a nearby state, a state very close to this one, where, you know those, there's a toilet and a sink, it's stainless steel, you probably got some of them in your newer buildings, and those things, there ain't no way in the world to kill yourself on those things. Like, they've been designed by space engineers, right? And where you get there's a little drinking fountain there. So it's a sink to wash up, it's a toilet, it's all one thing, carefully designed. And the little drinking fountain thing has looks like a little drinking fountain, right? And there's a little lip goes over that. That's called the splash guard. And there's a microscopic hole in that splash guard to allow air to get out so that it doesn't go all over the place when it hits it when the drink comes up. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. A kid in a nearby state was in that room unobserved long enough that he figured out a way to thread through that little tiny hole one little piece of thread, and then another little piece of thread, and then another little piece of thread. And he got enough through there and was able to braid it so that it could carry his weight, and he hung himself from it and died. And so I watched as hundreds of those little things were welded off because, you know, once you have a death that way. Of course, that wasn't why the kid died. The kid didn't die because of that little hole in the thing. The kid died because the person who was supposed to be watching him wasn't watching him, and he had hours and hours and hours to make that incredibly cool device. And you think about the potential of a child who is that creative and that good a problem solver. The problem was, how do I kill myself in a room that they have designed to be suicide proof? And this kid was able to devote enough focused attention and intelligence and creativity. And this isn't all we had to offer this child for a life was to die at the age of 15 by his own hand. Because the kid didn't have hope. He had despair. And I hate despair. Despair is my enemy. Time is on your side when it comes to suicide. Because if you intervene and keep a kid alive, there's more chance for hope the next day and the next day and the next day. So even if we can't fix a kid's suicidality instantaneously, just keeping them alive is a great thing because it gives us another shot at them another day. And the goal is to make it hard to kill yourself. Change the odds so that even if somebody's really, really despairing, it's really hard to beat you because you're so diligent at keeping them alive. Suicide, with rare exceptions, sometimes, and mostly it's in older folks, they just have chronic, long-standing depression or chronic physical ailments that are so severe that they just make a very logical decision that their life is so bad they want to end it. And those suicides are very difficult to prevent. Luckily, very few kids ever have had suicides of that type. For the vast majority of kids, and most of what you'll have to deal with, suicide is a crisis. And if our response to crisis is punitive, we're going to make it worse. So we want to think of suicide as a crisis where despair is rearing its ugly head, and our goal is to fight despair and instill hope. Nobody wants to disagree. Nobody thinks that our job is to kick some delinquent ass. You can't tell me there's nobody in this room that doesn't think that what these kids need is a good ass whooping. Well, how come you're not saying anything? If that's what you think, speak up. Well, I'll tell you what, I got a very short answer for that. So I'll say it since whoever in here thinks that isn't speaking up. But I know there's people in here who think that what some of these kids need is a good ass whooping. Well, I'm going to tell you the answer to that is, it's been tried. You ain't that tough that you can give them an ass whooping worse than they got before. In fact, that's probably how a lot of them got here. Right? Suicide is a decision that the only way to end my psychological pain is to die. So the more rigid, cognitively rigid, the more rigid people are in their thinking. And what I mean by that is, there are people who think on railroad tracks that there's one solution to every problem, right? You all know people like that. Some people in here are like that. There are also people who think of 100 solutions to every problem that are much more creative thinkers. And you need both kinds of people to run an institution, I'll tell you that. You need some people who just do their job and don't try to be creative about it. And you need some people who look for better ways to do their job. But when it comes to suicide, the more options that you can think of, the less likely you are to choose death. Usually when people have made a lethal suicide attempt and we interview them, what they say is, I couldn't think of any other way to stop hurting. And by the way, that means that they didn't think that talking to you would help. Okay. Any comments or questions? So, you know, it's hard in the South to do that. You go up to New York and I go, good morning, and somebody will go, well, not in Buenos Aires, it's actually afternoon, you know. So I usually smack the crap out of them. No, I'm just kidding. I've never hit anybody when I was doing that. But Southern audiences are very polite, so I hope I'm going to break through your polite silence and get you to talk some more. Any other comments or questions? Okay. You with me so far? Okay. All right. Today's effort is that we're going to do the same thing in Birmingham on Wednesday, and then on Thursday I'm going to meet with a bunch of clinicians, some of the case managers, psychologists in the system, and talk about how they do their job of getting people off of suicide watch. In the new policy, anybody can put a kid on suicide watch because we don't want this to happen, where a youth service aide says, I think Joel's suicidal, puts him on a psych list, and the psych comes in Monday morning to see the kid, and the kid's dead. So we want to make sure that we keep kids safe until they can be assessed by a mental health professional with some training. And in order to have more people who can do that follow-up, we're going to do some training on Thursday morning for them. So we have pre-service training. The shorter staffed you are, the less... How many of you are youth service aides in here? And how many... Did any of you... has anybody been hired in the last 2 years? Well, when you have systems like that where it's short staffing and there's no money, the first thing that goes is pre-service training, because you got an empty slot and you got to put somebody on the floor because there's nobody there. And so we have to put people to work before we can actually train them as much as we would like to. And in some places, without any training at all. And they call it OJT, but it's really W for work. So we want that. We also want in-service training like we're doing today, so that we reinforce these principles that we want to have. And we want leadership that's committed to this all the time. We want the leadership from Mr. Wood all the way through the system to be thinking about this all the time, just like we want you thinking about it all the time. Because when you think you've got it nailed, that's when you get the bad news. You have shift briefings. Perhaps the most consistently wasted 15 minutes of every correctional day in the United States is shift briefing. Well, you can use 5 minutes of that shift briefing to reinforce one of the principles that you want to make sure everybody's doing. Remember, when you guys do your watches, you don't have to only look at them every 15 minutes. And you got to make sure they're staggered so that the kid doesn't know you're not going to be back for 15 minutes. That took 30 seconds to say that. So in the shift briefings, for those of you who are supervisors, can be reinforcing these principles to your staff all the time. Training without supervision is a waste of time. I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, I do a lot of training, and I always wonder, are these folks going to get reinforced for doing the right thing when they go home after this, or have I just talked for no good purpose for 4 hours? Okay. Now I'm going to get more specific with you. Components of effective screening. There is a new suicide prevention policy. It's in draft form, and we're pretty close, right? We're going to have it out very, very shortly. Mr. Perry's in the back there. We want to have staff that are trained to screen so that when there's an intake, that intake workers have been specifically trained in how to do the screening. So when somebody comes in the door, you have certain things you do, like the Maisie, right? And that the people doing that are trained to do it properly, and that includes some type of suicide risk assessment screen. And it's usually about 10 questions, and they're pretty straightforward. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Have you ever tried to kill yourself? Have you lost anybody really important to you recently? Well, a lot of kids are going to say yes to that or lie. Because for one thing, the ones coming in the front door just lost their community, as I was saying earlier. But just ask them straightforwardly. And a lot of people in despair, if you ask them, will tell you they're in despair. Low threshold. What I mean by that is, if somebody looks, acts, or sounds suicidal, or makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or you don't feel comfortable going to sleep tonight knowing that you just brought this kid into the facility and nobody's watching them, err on the side of caution and refer them for some type of follow-up. Over half, every study that's ever been done of juvenile justice in the United States has shown that over half of the kids have some type of mental illness, and depression is a common one. If you take a handful of popcorn and close your eyes at Mount Meigs and throw it, every kernel's going to hit a depressed kid in the head. You have a sea of depression in that place. Even if you don't see it, it's because they just push it down under the surface because they don't want to look weak. But anybody here work the night shift as an aide? Ever? Did you ever have, how many times were that tough kid that doesn't show any weakness, you catch him on a weak moment, and he just, the minute that dam breaks, he can't stop crying. And it's just shared with you that night, and then he puts his face back on in the morning and usually smacks somebody in the head the next day to reassert his tough guy exterior. So we want to look for if they say they're suicidal, but even if they don't say it, if you think it, go ahead and err on the side of caution. We want false positives. We want kids to be identified who aren't suicidal. Why do you think that is? Why would we purposely want to identify a kid as a positive screen when in fact they're not thinking of killing themselves? Well, that's one reason, but there's an even simpler one. We know that no human decision making is perfect. So if you don't make a false positive mistake, guess what you're going to make? a false negative mistake, which means you're going to say you're not going to refer a kid who in fact is going to turn up stiff in the morning. That's why. We'd rather make a mistake of referring somebody that we didn't need to refer than to not refer somebody that's going to kill themselves. Documentation. Now we try to make the documentation simple so it doesn't add a lot of time to your... We don't have enough of you to start with. The last thing we want to do is waste time with documentation. But if you go to no documentation, that's even worse, because then nobody knows if this kid was screened or not. Nobody knows why he was screened positive. If Dr. Shaw sees the person in a follow-up and they don't know why you referred them, she doesn't even know what to ask them. Well, why'd they refer you? The kids always give you we used to call in New York the state government salute. Yeah. I was work for the state government. I'm just making fun of myself there, not you. Standardization, so that everybody gets screened the same way, so that we know that every kid who walks in the door was asked the same questions, so that we don't skip anything important. Okay. Intake screening takes place at the front door of the institution. Ideally, nobody should ever be unwatched until they've been screened for suicide. So typically the best, most efficient way to do that is the very first thing that they do when they come in. Many systems have the nurses do it because they're already set up to have the nurse catch them at the front door. And that helps with a lot of things. Communicable diseases, if a child is medically unstable and needs to go to an emergency room, we'd like to find that out early so they don't die on our watch, right? There are no exceptions. Everybody gets screened. For the bosses, I want to keep track of the percentage of positive screens, because that tells me, you know what I see in systems, a lot of times I get called to be expert witness after somebody died. You know what I see a lot is there's these little boxes next to each question, right? Yes or no? And there'll be a line drawn through no. Well, I know that and then I ask the kid, if they're still alive, did she ask you this question? Did he ask you that question? They always say no. He just said, you're not going to kill yourself, are you? I said, no, and they just went like that. Well, that's negligence, and that's the end of the lawsuit. The state loses. That's it. And again, we're going to over-identify, although we don't want to over-identify so much that we end up having to do expensive evaluations of everybody who comes in. But we always want to err on the side of caution. If you have to ask, you probably should refer them. So in some things I would tell you, if you're not sure of the answer, ask one of the other aides. Say, hey, you think this? If you got to ask about suicide, go ahead and refer. And I realize by saying this, I'm taking the already too high workload of Dr. Tippie and Dr. Shaw and Dr. Yarbrough, thank you, is going to go up. But we're trying. A big part of my goal is to get you more mental health clinicians, because you can't lower the need artificially to meet what resources you have. Nobody, that won't cut you any break if something bad happens. Communication, suicide prevention is everybody's business. Tell you a couple of stories. I was working in the Arizona State Prison. I was a kid. I think I was 25. And one night, Sergeant, I'm a musician, and I used to play with the inmate band a lot just for fun. They had a really good inmate band. And Sergeant Red Leonard I was a guitar player and a bass player. Sergeant Leonard was a bass player. He's one of these guys, you all know people like him. He's 35 years in the corrections, and he refused to take the lieutenant's exam because he thought lieutenant was just a lousy job. He didn't want any part of it. He was a good sergeant. That's all he wanted to do. And the inmates respected him. I loved him. He taught me so much. He was like a mentor to me. So one night, Sergeant Leonard is walking down the cell block, and they got the low lights. It's not off, but it's kind of low. And he walks past the cell of Charlie, who was an inmate that had schizophrenia. And back then, there wasn't much treatment for people that had serious mental illnesses in prison. And Sergeant Leonard walked by him, and Red said, "How you doing, Charlie?" Charlie said, "I'm cold, Sarge." And Sergeant Leonard the next day told me he doesn't know why he did this. But as soon as Charlie said, "I'm cold, Sarge," he screamed. Sergeant Leonard screamed, "Turn on the lights and open up." And he called out Charlie's cell number. And when the lights came up, there was an inch of blood covering the whole floor of Charlie's cell. He had slashed his wrist and his throat. They called the paramedic in. There was one, we always had a medic, I was a combat medic. Back then, all of our paramedic staff were people who had been combat medics in Vietnam, and they were better than doctors in an emergency, to be honest with you. And they ran over there, and they got the blood stopped, and they got him over to the emergency room, and the doctor told us 2-3 more minutes, and Charlie was a dead man. And Sergeant Leonard, just because of his experience and his trust in his instincts, he didn't even know what scared him about that, but something, because he had said good evening to Charlie 1,000 times. It was something different that scared him, and he called for help and saved a man's life. And saved a man's life. So when I say it's everybody's business, you'll never know which act of kindness gave somebody hope, or which one child's life. It could be clinical staff, it could be healthcare staff. A lot of kids. You know that 2/3 of all university health visits are for non-physical complaints. 2/3 of all the time people go to the nurse in high school, there's nothing wrong with them physically. The vast majority of those visits are depression and anxiety. Custody staff, clerical staff. Some of the kids will say something to a secretary that they would never say to a youth services aide. Everybody picks different people that they like to relate to in an institution. Volunteers come in, especially spiritual volunteers, chaplains. Visitors. Encourage your visitors. There's nothing wrong with letting people know. If you think that your loved one that you're visiting is thinking of killing himself, please, for the love of God, tell us so we can help him stay alive. Food service staff, very likely to pick it up because they know Joel always is begging for extra food. He's a big boy, he likes to eat, and the last few days he said, "I'm not that hungry." Just a little thing, but it's different, it's a change, something wrong, something not right with him. And you mention it to an aide, and the aide mentions it to the case manager says, "How you doing?" And the kid says, "Don't worry about me, you're not going to have to worry about me much longer anyway." And now we know we just saved the kid's life, because now we can make sure we keep them alive until we can restore some sense of hope. Janitorial staff. What's one of the first things to go when people get depressed? Statistically, at least a quarter of this audience has been depressed. You're Americans. That means 25% of Americans will have a clinical depression in their lifetime. Right? The first thing to go is sleep. People either sleep a lot more or a lot less when they get depressed. Well, when people can't sleep and they're in an institution, if you have any janitorial staff that are staff people or maintenance staff, a lot of that work gets done at night. That kid might be up and somebody might say, "How you doing tonight?" and see that the kid's crying and nobody knew about it. We got to have housing. We want to have a temporary watch once somebody's screened positive. I already mentioned that. So that they're kept safe until they can be assessed. Then the assessment determines the level of risk. The way that you guys have been doing business, to me, is not adequate because it puts too much on one person. That you got this at Mount Meigs, it'd be Dr. Shaw, who has to see this person isolated from their environment, usually to be in a room somewhere, and then try to make a decision about how much they have to be watched and for how long. And it might change. I might think, okay, this kid, we're going to put him on a not so tight watch because he's a little down, but he's not really suicidal. But at 4 o'clock in the morning, he might not be the same as he was this afternoon when I saw him. So we want to make it more systemic so that we're all working on this together. And the assessment then becomes ongoing. And if you have more information, that it gets passed along to somebody who has the ability to intensify the watch until the danger is past. So the assessment determines the level of risk, and the level of risk determines the level of watch. And we'll talk about what those are in a few minutes. We also, in the policy, youth on suicide watch are going to get programmed. If you have somebody on a constant watch, please give me any reason you can think of why they shouldn't go to school. Anybody? Because that's what you were doing, right? Kid was on suicide watch. He didn't go to school. So if you don't like school, what would be your percentage guess of how many of these kids love school? That's not the most common route to juvenile corrections, is by loving school, right? Somebody in prehistoric times, some idiot decided that, well, let's see, what should we do when a kid hates school so much that he acts the fool? Let's suspend him so he doesn't have to go. It boggles the mind. An educated person decided that. And what boggles the mind even more is that tens of thousands of educators since then have thought that was a good idea. So if you ever wanted a day off, all you had to do was commit some sin in school, and the punishment was to give you what you wanted. Now, personally, I thought it was a great idea when I was in school, because every once in a while I just needed a break. So I'd make a joke at a teacher's expense and get a day off. Or, I think they should, if you do bad things, they should make you go to more school. I'd have straightened up and flown right if they'd have done that. So there's no, unless now if somebody is suicidal and homicidal, and they're trying to hurt other people, that's different. We got to do what we got to do to keep other people safe. But if it's just suicide, kids should program. You want. You will never see where being alone in a room is a treatment for any mental illness. And if you're sad, being locked up alone with nothing to do is likely to make you sadder. Okay, any comments or questions before we go on to the levels of risk? Anybody here smoke cigarettes? All right. You're in charge of breaks. You tell me when you just got to have one, and then that's when we'll take a break. Now? We're okay now? Okay, good. So you let me know, all right? That's my worst thing. I always forget. I always get kind of carried away, and I forget about breaks. I did training for the United Auto Workers in Chrysler. We had this 500 people in this auditorium, and the union has guys that's all their only job is to make sure you break. I thought they were going to hurt me. I mean, they were standing in the back room going like this. I thought I had a contract out on me for a minute. They just wanted a cigarette. Okay, levels of risk. First of all, there is no such category as no risk in juvenile corrections. Why is that? Because they're, say again?
Because they're all locked up.
They don't have freedom, and we know that this is a high-risk population. They're adolescents. All of the demographic stuff changes so often. It used to be that teenagers were actually a low-risk group for suicide. That has changed remarkably in the last decade or so. And African-American teenagers have skyrocketed as a risk group to where they're, I think, the highest risk group now. So all these kids have some risk factors. Many of them have a lot of risk factors. The majority of your students are African Americans. They're all adolescents. Every single one of them has been rejected by somebody, or they wouldn't be here. Either their family, their community, or both. Many of them have seen brothers killed. My friend Carl Bell is a psychiatrist in Chicago, did a study of kids who observed their siblings getting killed. And almost 100% of these kids had tragic outcomes. So we had this group of people, the police are investigating a shooting, they know who the witnesses are, and they have this kid right there, and nobody's referring that kid for psychological services while we actually have a chance to do some good. So what we're going to do there is universal vigilance. You know when the AIDS scare came and people were looking for what the signs and symptoms of HIV and AIDS were, right? And finally it dawned on somebody to say, well, you know, do you have any sores that I can see? And say, no, oh good, thank God, and then you're going to make out with them. It's probably better to you know, be careful who you make out with in general, and assume that everybody has a likelihood of an infectious disease. If you want to prevent yourself from getting the flu, you don't walk up to a stranger and say, do you have the flu? No, I don't have the flu. And oh, good, here, let's swap spit, all right? So universal precautions means you use common sense with everybody, and that's what we mean by standard risk. And I don't know whose word that was, but that's the right term. We've been wrestling with the word for that. But it's the basic baseline level of risk in an institution. And it means that that's a part of every minute of every hour of every day that we work, is to think about keeping people alive. Now, some kids who have a higher level of risk than the average kid in your institution, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow. I'm still not 100% sure about the term low here, because low implies like lower. And these are kids with a higher risk than the standard risk. And generally that's going to be somebody who's got a recent crisis or loss that might increase their chances of despair, and has a history of suicidal behavior, but not in the last 6 months. Now again, you're not going to make this determination. That's going to be made, except for the mental health professionals in the audience. But I want you all to know what these designations mean. And when they say high risk, that means that somebody is actively thinking or intending to end their life. And they're thinking about how to defeat you in your effort to keep them alive. You believe that they have serious suicidal intent, and please understand that people can die without suicidal intent. Some of these cutters it's a cry for help, If you cut the wrong vein too deep, you can die before help can save your life. If you hang yourself thinking that your roommate will scream for help and your roommate happens to be asleep, you can die when you didn't intend to. Raise your hand if you know a whole bunch of kids in your institution with good judgment. Right? Well, people die of bad judgment. So just because you don't think the kid meant it doesn't mean he's not at risk of death. Clear?
I have a question.
Yes, thank you.
In these risks that I have interviewed a student in the past who, somebody whose family committed suicide. And his response to that, because that's one of the questions when you do anything, is have you ever thought about hurting yourself? Or have you ever attempted it? He said, his response was, no, that's the weak way out. And that just, as you said, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. So I made arrangements for him to sleep toward the front, supposed to be observed by staff, do sleeping areas, sleeping time, and so forth. Because that response just was something I had not heard in 20-something years of working. No, that's the weak way out. I wouldn't do it like my, because that was just the weak way out.
I give you an A on that. And the only reason I didn't give you an A plus is the one thing I would have wanted is more conversation about, say more about that. What do you mean by that? What's the tough way out? Well, the tough way out is to have the cops kill you. Well, right? We're not done talking, my friends. So one of the best questions to ask is, it's not even a question, it's a statement. I don't understand what you mean. To get them talking, because the more they talk, the more they're going to reveal, even if they don't intend it. They're not that skillful at most of life, right? So, but you're right on the money. That kind of, what the heck did that mean? You're not done yet, or make the referral. And what you did is you took some intermediate steps, and what we're going to try to do is to standardize some of those things, so that you're not sort of hanging out to dry on your own judgment, that we have a system that's predictable for how to do this. That's a great comment. Anybody else? We're good? You must not smoke that much. That's good. You should quit if you're down to that few cigarettes. You should quit. Okay. Now let's get into these in a little more detail. The standard risk kid, this is every single kid in the institution is at least this much risk, will have no history of serious suicidality. So you say, have you ever thought about killing yourself? I'll act this up. Have you ever thought about killing yourself? Well, who hasn't? Well, I don't know. Do you think that's something everybody thinks about? Well, just, a passing thought. Yeah, well, have you ever had that passing thought? Well, sure. How often would you say you have it? Oh, not very often. Probably once a week at the most. That's a real conversation, right? Those extra couple of questions that your common sense tells you you're not done just revealed 52 times a year he thinks about dying. Now, what would you rate his level of despair from the first question I asked him? Who hasn't? I don't know. I don't know what his level of despair. What do you think it was after this? Right? You with me? So, few risk factors. You're not going to have any kids that have zero. And all incarcerated youth are at elevated risk compared to the general population who's not locked up. Yes? Well, actually, I wouldn't be quite ready there. I would want to ask the kid a few more questions, so I'll carry that one on. So am I understanding you right that you think about killing yourself once a week? I don't think about killing myself, but I do think about dying a lot. What makes you think about dying? What would be the thing that would happen right before that? Like, when's the last time that you thought about that? Oh, some teacher asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. What'd you tell her? I told her I wanted to be 17. 17. So you think that you don't have a good chance of being 17? Now, 3 members of my family didn't see 17, so I'm not so sure why I should be any luckier than they are. I would not call that kid a high risk and put him on constant observation, but I would call him a low risk until we see how he adapts to the institution, because this is somebody who his despair meter isn't that high, but his hope meter is down here. He's got nothing that he's looking forward to. So he's more of a risk than your average kid at this point. Now, what I'll then want to do over time, I want to see how he adapts to the institution, find out if he forms any connections with other kids or staff, or is he a loner. There's a lot of other things that would go into it subsequently. And those are things that a mental health professional, instead of having a 5-minute conversation or a 10-minute conversation, would probably have a much longer one. And often you learn more after those first few hours once they get a chance to get their feet under them in an institution. Does that answer your question, Dudley?
I'm seeing, well, tattoos have always been around, but I'm seeing a lot more kids coming in with like Grim Reapers and skulls, crossbones.
Are you talking about tattoos?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, tattoos have become an indicator of nothing. I used to love tattoos because it told me a lot about people. Now it just tells me that they live in the United States of America, and and at least if they're over 50, it means they were, at least once they got drunk on shore leave. I will tell you this, that having a tattoo is different than people who have really extreme amounts of body art, and whether, for mental health professionals, it's still interesting in terms of, I like to talk to people about why they selected certain tattoos, the quality of them. Some kids that have beautiful art on their body, I don't like it, but they think of it as a positive art thing, and I need to respect that. Some of you that have been blessed with long life will remember when the Beatles came to America, and a whole bunch of kids started growing their hair long, or when the Mod Squad was on TV. Remember Link? And all of a sudden, people started growing these big afros, and their parents were shocked and offended, right? Well, now fast forward to 2010, when the parents got big afros and long hair, and how's a kid going to shock you now? Right? So we kind of kept up in the ante, so that now you got to punch holes in your body and draw ugly pictures on yourself to shock your parents. But shocking your parents, cave people used to I made a square wheel, deal with it, Dad. In caveman times, people have been shocking their parents since there were parents. Yeah, Dr. Shaw.
I was just going to say, one way the tattoo could be significant. A kid's really quiet, doesn't want to tell you much, but when they got RIP on their arm, you might find out about deaths on their family and who they're honoring and gifted.
Absolutely. Or if they see the tears, you guys don't have, you have a lower population of Mexicans, but where I come from, in Mexican culture, a lot of the kids will put tears on for either everybody they've killed or every significant loss that they've had, or RIP if it's jailhouse tattoos, it's something to talk about. But unfortunately, just whether or not somebody's got tats is not very informative anymore because it's such a predominant part of our culture. So, good question, though. Time for a break. It's 20 after, so I'll see y'all back. If I say 10 minutes, you'll be back in 15. You swear? Okay, I'll see you in 10 minutes.